Hello, I'm Beryl Dov-Lerner. I teach philosophy at the Western Galilee College in Israel. This is my presentation entitled Ignorance and Authenticity for the Freedom and Authenticity Fifth International Interdisciplinary Conference. I'll just begin with a little caveat that as I developed the topic for this talk, it developed from authenticity more towards perhaps sincerity, I think a closely related concept, and to some extent, intellectual honesty. First, allow me to introduce you to William Paley, if you haven't heard of him, a British cleric, naturalist, and theologian. You see his dates here, 1743 to 1805. And what interests me in particular is his most famous work, Natural Theology, a book in which he attempted to demonstrate the existence of God based on the scientific knowledge of his time. Now, how did he go about doing this? Well, the book opens with a very famous passage, the watch analogy. I'll soon read a little bit of it, where he discusses the difference between an intricate, artificially created object like a watch as compared to a stone. Here is the passage. In crossing a heath, which is wide open spaces, a natural environment, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch, and I should remind you that at the time, watches, pocket watches, were the height of high tech. The intricate mechanisms of the pocket watch and its ability to tell time accurately were very impressive to people at the time. Something like the latest iPhone. So suppose he found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. Yet, why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? For this reason and no other, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. That is, they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the several parts had been differently shaped from what they are, of a different size from what they are, or placed after any other manner, or in any other order, then that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none would have answered the use that is now served by it. So in this analogy, Paley is trying to tell us that when you see an object which is formed in such a way that it has an intricate mechanism that seems to serve some kind of recognizable goal, we assume that it was created by some kind of intelligent designer. Of course, what he's going to do in the rest of the book is he's going to look at various aspects, various items that exist in the natural world, and he will try to show that they're similarly designed with many intricate parts to work together towards a recognizable goal. And this will demonstrate that just as the watch requires a watchmaker, nature requires a designer, and this designer is, of course, the God of theism. So I'll just give you a famous example that he gives of this, when he talks about the eye, he goes into great biological detail. I won't go into that, but just the beginning of the section is, I know no better method of introducing so large a subject than that of comparing a single thing with a single thing. An eye, for example, with a telescope. As far as the examination of the instrument goes, there is precisely the same proof that the eye was made for vision as there is that the telescope was made for assisting it, for assisting the eye and assisting vision. They are made upon the same principles, both being adjusted to the laws by which the transmission and refraction of rays of light are regulated. I speak not of the origin of the laws themselves, but such laws being fixed, the construction in both cases is adapted to them. So here's a more particular example. You see my little diagram of the eye. It has many parts. They work together according to the laws of optics to help us see properly. And Paley requires that this have some kind of explanation, which would lead us to the assumption that there is a God. Well, since I'm a philosopher, I want to get a little formal about this and describe and identify the kind of explanation that Paley is using. And this is called the inference to the best explanation. Here's how it works. A certain phenomenon, in our case, the functionally efficient complexity in nature, for instance, the complex eye, which is functional, it allows us to see. Well, this is seen to take place. We know that there are all kinds of systems and items in nature which have functionally efficient complexity. 2, the best explanation for that phenomenon assumes the truth of proposition P. In our case, the best explanation we can think of for that phenomenon assumes the existence of a divine creator. Therefore, there is good reason to believe that P is true. In other words, to believe that there is a divine creator. We believe that a divine creator exists because we require his existence in order to be able to use the best explanation for these phenomenon which we witness of functionally efficient complexity in nature. I'd like to introduce another person, Richard Dawkins. Perhaps you've heard of him. He's still alive, a British evolutionary biologist and popular science writer, and a notorious or celebrated, depending how you look at it, atheist. Here we see his book, The Blind Watchmaker, which is devoted to an attack on the kinds of arguments that Paley offers. They're called the arguments from design. And he wants to say that modern evolutionary theory can replace the role of the watchmaker in creating functionally efficient design, and it can do it blindly. You don't need some kind of intelligent designer to explain all of these different biological organisms, etc. So here he writes in that book, Paley compares the eye with a designed instrument such as a telescope and concludes that there is precisely the same proof that the eye was made for vision as there is that the telescope was made for assisting it. The eye must have a designer, just as the telescope had. Paley's argument is made with passionate sincerity as is informed by the best biological scholarship of his day. But it is wrong, gloriously and utterly wrong. So what is going on here? If I again return to inference to the best explanation, there are at least 2 ways to attack an argument of the form of inference to the best explanation. One of them, which I won't go into, is to challenge the criteria for ranking explanations. That is a large topic in philosophy of science, because you could have different explanations. One could be simpler and the other more complex, and one can explain more a broader scope of phenomenon than the other, and one could be better harmonized with other accepted theories in science than the other, and it becomes very complicated. That's not our problem. Our problem is, our interest is, produce an alternative and superior explanation. Inference to the best explanation is based on the assumption that I know what the best explanation is. If I have an alternative explanation, that can undermine the inference to the best explanation. And of course, the superior explanation here will be, certainly according to Dawkins, modern evolutionary theory in biology. So where does that leave Dawkins? What is Dawkins' attitude towards Paley, who has come to a bad conclusion based on outdated science? His attitude towards Paley himself is actually very positive. And he writes, "But one thing I shall not do is belittle the wonder of the living watches that so inspired Paley. On the contrary, I shall try to illustrate my feeling that here Paley could have gone even further. When it comes to feeling awe over living watches, I yield to nobody. I feel more in common with the Reverend William Paley," and this is the great atheist Dawkins, "than I do with a distinguished modern philosopher, a well-known atheist, with whom I once discussed the matter at dinner. I said that I could not imagine being an atheist at any time before 1859, when Darwin's Origin of Species was published." So this is remarkable. Here we have Dawkins showing great appreciation for William Paley and saying that he himself would have certainly accepted Paley's argument had he not been aware of modern evolutionary biology. So for Dawkins, Paley is wrong, but he's also intellectually virtuous. And I repeat the statement: Paley's argument is made with passionate sincerity, as an informed by the best biological scholarship of his day. So Paley's failure to recognize the alternative evolutionary explanation of biological complexity does not result from intellectual vices. It isn't that he's lazy. It isn't that he's closed-minded. It isn't that he is afflicted with confirmation bias, that he only seeks evidence that confirms his conclusions. He's not a coward, and he's not seeking personal benefit. He is being an honest seeker of truth. And yet he does not recognize the alternative evolutionary explanation of biological complexity, for a very good reason. It would be unreasonable to expect Paley to have thought up Darwin's theory of evolution and its refinement via the invention of modern genetics, because people who know the history of biology know that Darwin's theory on its own had a huge problem with it. He did not have a genetic theory which would take evolution off the ground. He had to wait for modern genetics with the possibility of mutations and genes and et cetera in order for it to really work. So you can't expect Paley to have invented 50 years or 80 years of biology by himself and then have realized that there was this alternative explanation. So Dawkins can appreciate Paley's sincerity because he recognized the validity of design as a possible explanation of biological complexity. It could have been design if something better hadn't come along. Dawkins thinks that Paley's argument fails due to Paley's completely understandable ignorance of alternative explanations for design. So now let me extend our example, and this will lead to a hypothesis that I will leave to others to explore if they find it interesting. So I think that the relationship between Dawkins and Paley may be seen as exemplary of a broad character of literature, what happens in a broad category of literature. So far, I've just been talking about the design argument and what happened when evolution came along. But instead of talking in those very specific terms, we could ask about the broader issue of the relationship between pre-modern religious writing and the Enlightenment critique of religion, which involved many more aspects than just a evolutionary theory that could counter the argument from design for the existence of God, right? It included textual criticism of the Bible and philosophical work on the possibility of on the understanding of miracles and all kinds of things. So, just as Paley could not be expected to have taken evolutionary theory into account before its invention, we cannot expect ancient or medieval religious writers to take account of the entire Enlightenment critique of religion. And say, again, this starts with things like Spinoza's critique of scripture, David Hume's argument against reports of miracles, and all of that avant la lettre. You can't say, what is wrong with these religious writers? Why are they being lazy? Why are they being dishonest? Why are they being closed-minded? Why aren't they taking into account all of these problems with religion? Because you can't expect somebody in the ancient or medieval world to have invented an entire epoch of Western thinking on their own, just in order to have a critical view of their own writing. That means that the post-Enlightenment religious writer is in a very different position from the pre-Enlightenment religious writer. The post-Enlightenment religious writer can be expected to take these things into account. If a post-Enlightenment religious writer wants to bring evidence for miracles for religious belief, they have to deal with David Hume's critique of miracles. If they want to base their theistic belief on the argument from design, they have to take into account evolution. And this leads to the great 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein is writing, an honest religious thinker is like a tightrope walker. He almost looks as though he were walking on nothing but air. His support is the slenderest imaginable, and yet it really is possible to walk on it. Wittgenstein himself being something of a pious man. So this finally leads to the empirical hypothesis that I'd like to leave you with. This hypothesis is based on the assumption that there are certain stylistic and rhetorical markers of genuine sincerity and intellectual honesty. So I write, thanks to their writers' legitimate ignorance of the Enlightenment critique of religion, older religious texts can display the stylistic and rhetorical characteristics of passionate sincerity, while modern religious texts are more likely to display rhetorical and stylistic characteristics of insincerity, since they are prone to display inexcusable ignorance or misrepresentation of the Enlightenment critique, and also perhaps of their own religious traditions, which they may misrepresent to make them look more defendable. So I leave that to, I don't know, people perhaps in digital humanities can try to find these cues. If you'd like this lecture and you'd like to get in touch with me, here is my email address. Thank you very much.